What is up, guys? My name is Parks Gore, and today I'm going to be reviewing James George Frazer's Golden Bough. So this book came to me by chance. There's a little bookstore near me about 15 minutes out from where I'm at, and you can get used books for about $1. So it's super sick, and they're always getting new arrivals. And I was checking out the other day, and I looked right behind the cashier lady, and I stopped her in the middle of her talking about her garden. I was like, whoa, stop, shut up, please. Can you hand me that copy of Golden Bough? And sure enough, I got this copy, this abridged copy, for about $1. I've got some extensive notes here, so we're going to be kind of dissecting this. I'm going to be reviewing it and just kind of talking about a lot of the main ideas and the main themes here and my reaction to it and if I would recommend it. So, essentially, Golden Bough, for those of you who don't know, this is an essential work when it comes to comparative religion. So I've been studying comparative religion for quite a while now, and it's sort of been my main area of focus. I was not planning on reading Golden Bough this early. I'd always heard good things about it, but when it shows up in front of you for $1 at the bookstore, you're just like, okay, might as well jump into this. Now, this book is massive, so I don't know if you saw it whenever I picked it up. This book is like some 900 pages. I mean, it is like not a quick read. This is going to take you quite a bit of time if you do choose to read it. And I knew that going into it, but I figured that the material would be rewarding enough for my own kind of realm of study that it would merit a full read through. But just kind of talking about the background behind the work. So Frazer was a Scottish anthropologist who was active around, I believe, he was born in 1854. And so he started publishing the first volume of Golden Bough in 1890, and then he concluded the publication of its volumes in 1915. So this copy that I have here is actually not the full Golden Bough. This is a miniature abridged Golden Bough. Really, it's a multi-volume text. And the main thing here is Frazer himself was a atheist, or a lot of people even thought that he might be a hermeticist or a sort of Neoplatonic guy. I'm not at all surprised to hear that, and so it makes sense. It makes sense, right? Like, you read the Golden Bough, the main thing in this book is that he's comparing all these different primitive religions, and he's trying to make sense of this one ritual that he has come across, and he's trying to find the origin of this ritual, and he's using comparative mythology to try and uncover this origin. And so a lot of people thought he was atheist because he's kind of critical of Christianity and Catholicism in this book, but later writings, it makes it seem more like, well, maybe he's not an outright atheist. Maybe he does believe in some sort of skeleton religion that's behind all these different religions, which obviously is what Neoplatonism is mostly centered around. And so a lot of people, we don't really know what his personal beliefs were about these things. And so my first impression of the contents of the work was I was very excited. I was very intrigued. Like I said, this was right up my alley. It was a total chance encounter with this book, and so I was ready to kind of sink my teeth into it. I don't think you start a 900-page book unless you're very excited about what could potentially be gained from reading it. And it seemed like the book had a lot to offer, especially for someone studying mythology. And so the book pretty much opens up with this main question, this main mystery. So Frazer, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. It could be Frazer, it could be Frazer, I don't know. But he opens up with this mysterious figure called the Priest of Nemi. And this Priest of Nemi he has another name, which is the King of the Wood. And essentially what we have going on here is there's this mysterious lineage of priests who are in this place called Arisia, and the origin of this priesthood is totally unknown, and we don't really have any information about this priesthood. Now, the priest was a king of a sacred grove, which was itself by a lake, and no one was to... Oh, sorry, I'm reading my notes here. I'm getting confused. And so there was essentially this legend that surrounded the priest of Nemi, the king of the wood. So no one was supposed to break off any branch of a certain sacred oak within the grove, except if a runaway slave happened to break off a branch of this sacred oak, he could engage the king of the wood, the priest of Nemi, in mortal combat. And if the slave were to slay the priest, then he would then become the priest, the king of the wood. And, he would then essentially take up the mantle, and he would have to fight off future challengers. And so you essentially have this whole priesthood that is established on killing the former priest. So this is kind of strange. It's actually really strange. And once again, so Frazer is setting out to kind of figure out if he can just discover what the source of this tradition is. And so after establishing that mystery that we intend to uncover, Frazer implements a study of various magical and religious rites throughout the world, both ancient and modern, in order to kind of find the origin of this thing, or what at least is the likeliest origin. And so we can't really discuss Frazer's work without discussing his sort of theory of magic, because a lot of people like to point to this book as a quintessential text on comparative religion, but I think what it is more than that even is it's a text that centers around magic. Where does magic come from? Why do people believe in magic? How do these different magical systems get developed? And so Frazer kind of sets forth this theory of magic that I think is kind of interesting, and it's definitely worth discussing if you want to understand anything within the work going forward. So essentially, before man is able to conceive of a sophisticated philosophical metaphysics, he essentially lives in a state of supreme superstition, right? And he's thinking that he has to try and pretty much survive on his own will and his own cunning. And so a lot of people tend to think of religion as this kind of primitive thing that, people believe in gods and they have to appease gods, and this is where we get these primitive religions. Frazer says no, actually. Before people can even begin to abstractly conceive of some personality or some god that has to be appeased, they tend to just look at the world in terms of how can I survive and how can I influence the world just with my own will. And if you think about it, this is not out of continuity with the modern day understanding or modern day instantiation of magic, right? So Aleister Crowley, his whole system of magic essentially boiled down to one single commandment, which is do what thou wilt, right? That's kind of what sorcery and magic is all about. It's about imposing your will on reality. And for these primitive people, that sort of came out of a sense of necessity and a sense of fear. If they do have any sort of conception of spirits or gods or anything like that, they tend to conceive of them as just high-level wizards, right? These are just wizards who have gained a large amount of control over the environment and can control the rain or can be invisible or what have you. And so, essentially, the environment of the savage is a place that is heavily enchanted, right? Every single thing is imbued with some sort of spirit, right? This is where animism comes from. Animism is just this idea that all things have some kind of a life in them, right? Before I can cut down this tree, I need to appease the tree or the spirit of the tree. And so there's no real opportunity for any sort of separation between theology and the concerns of everyday survival. And science has not been developed, and so things like, fortune in hunting or the avoidance of sickness or natural disaster or even the restoration of the sun at the end of every single night and day cycle, droughts, floods, all of these things are dependent on man's will in the magical conception of the savage. And so according to Frazer, magic kind of takes two primary forms. There could be more forms, but he tends to hone in on these two specifically. There's homeopathic, or what he calls sympathetic magic, and then there's imitative magic. And imitative magic is essentially this idea that like produces like. So if I want it to rain, I have to simulate rain, or I have to produce some condition of wetness. So for example, he talks about a modern day ritual of some people who will climb up trees and will pour buckets of water off of the tree and then start banging the buckets together to simulate thunder. And this is, through imitative magic, meant to induce rain. Or a lot of times people will just wet the tops of things, or they'll wet the tops of their heads. The structure of the book is that he'll sort of introduce an idea like this, a general sort of idea or superstition, and then he'll corroborate it with examples from history or examples from just reports of people who have contacted remote tribes and stuff like that. And he'll kind of show how this belief is consistent across many different cultures. And so that's imitative magic. But then also you have what's called homeopathic or sympathetic magic. And why is it called sympathetic magic? Because when you have sympathy, you are simultaneously you are, and then path is like what? To feel. Pathos. So you are feeling simultaneously. So sympathetic magic essentially works on the idea that there are unseen connections between things. And so, for example, the savage is going to be very careful and very particular about how he disposes of his clothing, how he gives out his name. Like a lot of savage tribes, they don't want to tell you their name, so they'll have some sort of nickname, or they'll lie about what their real name is. They will, what else do? They are careful about how they dispose of fingernails, or making sure that their spit is buried. They don't want any part of their body to fall into the hands of an enemy wizard, because think voodoo magic, right? Voodoo magic, you get some hair from someone, you put it on a doll, and then when you hit the doll with a needle or something, that person is supposed to fall dead or something. And so you think about voodoo, that's essentially what's going on with sympathetic magic. He also gives an example of some tribe where anytime I think someone would die or something like that, for fear of awakening their spirit or calling their spirit forth, once someone dies, you would no longer use their name anymore in everyday speech. And he talked about how it was a problem because people in this tribe would be named after actual objects and animals. And so a person, their name would be deer, and then they would die. And now we don't use the word deer anymore for elk. We only say elk. We don't use the other word for elk because we don't want to awaken the spirit of this person. And so he would talk about how a lot of people who would live amongst these tribes would be very perplexed because over the course of a year, their entire language would shift and change and take on a completely different meaning. And he talks about how this specific superstition really made it hard for these primitive peoples to develop any real sense of history. Because, I mean, how can you talk about history if you can't even name people or you can't even name things or events? And so that's sympathetic magic in a nutshell. And so let me make sure I've gone through all this. So essentially, Frazer gives, and on the topic of the person who was banging the buckets of water together. So what's funny about this is, eventually in the primitive mind, it becomes pretty clear that some people have more of a knack for this sort of magic stuff than others, right? And so if you're someone who's pretty good at magic, or you seem to be good at magic, because Frazer essentially admits that, all of this is purely superstition, none of it's really grounded in reality. But let's say someone does a rain ritual and then it starts raining. Well, that person's going to get a reputation for being able to control the rain. And so he kind of says that, a certain status and a certain influence begins to coalesce around this person. And so the office of the wizard was one of the earliest kind of, you could say, political offices. And, eventually this wizardly or priestly position sort of, it gains a lot of wealth, it gains a lot of status for the person. And you can see how over time this would develop into sort of a kingly position. And so, far from being here's the thing too, is a lot of people think about like the ancient king as someone who was just a tyrant over the people. But really, especially if you read Gerard, it becomes pretty obvious reading Gerard and Frazer that these kingly positions are in no way like enviable positions. If anything, the position of being sacred is something that is highly ambivalent. So you wield a lot of power, but also you have a lot of taboo attached to you, and you have a lot of rules and regulations around your own behavior, and people are frightened of you so much so that they're willing to scapegoat and even off you if things don't go as they're supposed to. Because think about it, if you're responsible for the rain falling and the rain doesn't fall, well, people are going to assume that either you're malicious or your powers are waning. And one thing that Frazer kind of points to is that, once it becomes recognized that the king's power is waning, and a lot of times the king was thought of as some instantiation or some incarnation of some god. Once it becomes obvious that the king's power is waning, a lot of times people will scapegoat the king, get rid of the king, because they want to preserve the freshness of this they want to preserve the freshness of the deity. They don't want the deity to grow old and stale. And so there's this huge focus on cycles, a huge focus on rebirth, a huge focus on trying to keep the wheel spinning. Because again, the savage believes that he is sort of responsible for the sun rising in the morning, and that it's partly his duty to ensure that it continues to rise day after day. And so funny enough, there's a report in the book of an ancient king who, assuming the role of a rainmaker, actually would use special effects to make it appear as though lightning and thunder and rain were occurring around his person. And Frazer actually says that this king reportedly died by being struck by lightning. So it's kind of ironic that. Another thing too, and I couldn't help but notice this as I was reading this, but our earliest conceptions of Yahweh are as a storm warrior god. That seems to be what the earliest literature around Yahweh, points to, how people kind of understood him. And also too, in the Old Testament, Yahweh's main sort of, the main god that, people tend to run to when they're deserting Yahweh is typically Baal, who was also seen as a storm god. And so like the whole storm thing, it kind of pops up a lot, honestly. There's a huge focus on rain, storms, and this sort of thing. And then also too, you think about like Odin or things like that, Zeus, they're all sky storm gods. And on the topic of Odin, it's funny because in the beginning we were talking about how the sacred grove, it was an oak tree which you were forbidden to break a bow from. And the oak is seen as something that is really sort of charged with this sort of sacred energy in a lot of cultures around the world. And Odin himself was viewed as not just a lightning god, but also a god of the oak. And so it's kind of funny that there's a lot of overlaps here. That's what I was kind of looking for whenever I was going into this book. I was more so interested in those sorts of things, like the similarities between established religions. I did not expect to get into a whole study of magic systems and all this sort of thing, but it's what you get. You go into a book expecting one thing and then you get something totally different, but it's okay. Anyways, in the same vein of thought around sort of the magical production of rain, I actually heard a funny story from a friend while I was reading this book and I was sort of researching all these superstitions. My friend told me that he's working construction right now, and there's a superstition in construction where if you draw a turtle in the ground, then it's supposed to rain. And a lot of construction workers, they really look for and hope for rain, because if it rains, then you can't do any construction for the day. You get rained out, you get to go home. I know that because I worked construction and it was grueling. And yes, you do pray for rain some days. And so it's funny. But I went to try and corroborate this superstition with my dad, who has done construction literally his entire adult life since he was like 19. I was like, hey, is it true that if you draw a turtle in the ground, it's supposed to rain? Like, that's like a belief that people in construction have. And he said, no. He said, no, that's actually not the belief. The belief is actually not a superstitious belief at all. It's more of a heuristic. And it's, you draw a turtle in the ground, and once the shell of the turtle becomes totally covered with water, then you get to go home. And so that changes it a little bit. That's not quite the same, because if it's, you draw a turtle and then it makes rain happen, that's different than you draw a turtle to see how much it's been raining. And my dad even said this sort of fell out of practice ever since, we have like weather radars and stuff. You don't need to use this sort of primitive heuristic, but it's just kind of funny. I made a note here that, even today in the modern day, we have even heuristics, things that we use to gauge the weather or gauge, the working conditions and stuff like that. Even these heuristics are not above being relegated to the realm of superstition and myth and all these sorts of things. So it's funny how these things can get altered, right? It's funny how these things can get transmitted wrongly. But all that to say, we're looking at these primitive tribes and we're thinking, oh, they're doing this thing because they think that pouring water from the top of a tree is going to make it rain. Well, maybe in the past, this thing actually served some real purpose for the savage. Or it currently serves a purpose for the savage, and they just are not able to communicate it very well. I don't know. To me, it seems like there's always going to be more going on in the realm of, mythological thought than we're able to sort of grasp at a first glance. And so, one thing here that I couldn't help but think about quite a lot is the ego development theory of Suzanne Cook-Greuter. So, essentially, ego development theory has to do with kind of showing a roadmap of the development of human personality and meaning-making structures. And in ego development theory, there's this whole idea that, we kind of start out in a sense of superstition and kind of magical thinking as children. And then later on, we kind of grow up to be more rational, more thoughtful, able to consider different perspectives. And then, you'll find people who are incredibly wise, who are able to sort of think supra-rationally. So they're not thinking irrationally, but they realize that only thinking rationally is itself kind of a limit. And, a lot of things that we know are not rationally apprehended. And so as I'm reading this book, I can't help but think about ego development theory quite a lot, because we see here, the human mind in some of its kind of earliest stages of development, and human societies at some of their earliest stages of development. And, Frazer's lack of faith placed him in kind of a rudimentary position relative to the savage, right? And this seems counterintuitive, right? Because Frazer, throughout the book, he tends to make himself seem like he's got all the answers, and these savages are just total idiots. But the savage is essentially acting on his best knowledge at the time. He is attempting to create a theory of knowledge with his magical implements. And, Frazer's tone throughout seems to be like, well, we already have a fully developed theory of knowledge, and, we know that it's not this. And so these savages are totally lacking something. And, I want to be really careful here not to get overly simplistic, because as I was reading reviews for this book, I found some liberal people talking about how it's like colonialist or whatever. And it's such a lame, boring, and lazy way to look at this. Just like the moralizing over Frazer, you just got to understand where this guy's coming from. He's right post-Enlightenment, and he thinks that reason and rationality are kind of the end-all, be-all of things. And also, let's not act like these savages, let's not act like they weren't savages. There's this whole concept of the noble savage, where actually these people were kumbaya, and they were all peace and love, man. And I've talked about this in plenty of other episodes, the evidence of human sacrifice and the total disregard for human rights and dignity, and people being made in the image of God, it could not be more apparent than in these ancient cultures, these ancient religions, right? There's whole chapters about the human sacrifice of the Aztecs, and there's no pretense here about why they're doing it. The savages, primitives themselves will admit, yes, we are doing this to appease a certain devil, a certain demon who is threatening us and is tormenting us, and we have been told by it, or we have come to the realization that human sacrifice will kind of get him off of our back for a while. And anyone who's read Girard knows that this is this is the scapegoat mechanism. This is been operative in human history and human culture since the foundation of the world, name dropping the Girard book. And so essentially, I think to say that, Frazer is a colonialist because he's saying that the rational, reasonable man of post-Enlightenment Britain is, his ways are above the savage. Frazer he's living in his own context. He's living in his own time. He's looking at this with he's looking at his own worldview through rose-colored glasses. He doesn't understand what he doesn't understand. And part of the reason why I referenced ego development theory earlier is because in ego development theory, again, we kind of look at how you start out with superstitional or magical thinking, and then you progress hopefully into more rational thinking, and then hopefully you even progress beyond merely rational thinking. But one of the things that's really stressed in ego development theory is that the earlier stages cannot possibly understand or begin to fathom the later stages. And not only that, but the intermediate stages, so you could say the rational stages, they do this thing where they try to pull the ladder up after them. They don't understand the necessity of the earlier stages. They don't understand that they themselves have progressed out of the superstition and kind of magical thinking into their rational stage, and they think that it's like wholly unnecessary. They don't understand that they are sort of indebted to this stage of development. And so in ego development theory, it seems that there is a sort of anger or resentment felt at the intermediate stages toward these earlier stages, these more primitive or these more superstitious stages, because how do they not get it? How do they not understand that if we can just put morality under a microscope, then we can figure it out, right? It's like the Reddit, it's the midwit meme. It's the midwit meme par excellence. It's like you have these total idiot primitives that are like, oh my gosh, the spirit world is real. We have to do something about this. And then you have the midwit that's like, oh, if only they knew science and rationality is going to figure out everything for us. And then you have the super rational or the genius who's like, the spirit world is real. We need to do something about this. And so, as I was looking up information about this book to try to, prepare for this episode for you guys, I came across a review of this book by Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein actually has a published work where he is reviewing the Golden Bough, or it's his notes on the Golden Bough. So he had written some little marginal notes on just his thoughts on the book. And Wittgenstein was kind of angry at Frazer because he recognized in Frazer this sort of hypocrisy or this lack of self-awareness where essentially Wittgenstein, he sums it up pretty simply and pretty beautifully in this quote where he says, Frazer is much more savage than most of his savages because he is not aware of the presuppositions of his own thinking. Now, I don't even think if you told a savage what a presupposition was, I don't think the savage would know, but the savage is not to blame for that because, the savage is not operating on a rationalistic framework, but Frazer, he's not a very self-aware thinker, but also I think he's a product of his time. People were not yet fully understanding what the death of God meant, right? Nietzsche was also active during this time, and Nietzsche foretold of an event in not that far in the future, where essentially the rationalist revolution, the Enlightenment, it would produce a sort of river of blood, which, the likes of which mankind has never seen before. And Girard kind of talks about this, where originally the scapegoat mechanism, this kind of human sacrificial element to all societies and cultures, when it was operational, or when it was operating in a context where people actually believed in the sacred and they actually believed in kind of the spiritual realm, it had a real power, it had a real weight to kind of calm people down and satiate people. Even though it was abhorrent and violent and evil, it had a potency. He talks about, again, earlier we talked about how the sacred, it's something that's sort of ambivalent. It's very powerful and efficacious on the one hand, but it's also very toxic and can cause a lot of damage on the other. And so it can be likened to something that is both a cure and a poison. It's like an antidote and a poison at the same time. Well, Girard kind of talks about how now that we live in a post-Christian world, we live in a world where Christ has shown us the scapegoat mechanism once and for all for what it is. The power or the efficacy of sacrificial victims is not the same as it was in the pre-Christian world. So now we live in a global village, as people like to call it, and sacrificing one person or scapegoating one person doesn't have quite the same effect as it did when your village was 12 people. And so now that we're in a global village, scapegoating takes place on a much larger scale, right? Think about the communist revolutions, think about the Holocaust, think about all these times throughout history where, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people were slain in the name of a given ideology or in the attempt to establish a certain, new culture, brave new world. But Frazer seems to hammer home his insistence that, we have magical thinking where man tries to enforce his will on nature and develop a sort of a system for understanding nature. And then you have religious thinking where, magic is sort of getting pushed out. The people are realizing that the magic is not working. Whatever these gods or spirits are, they're of a totally other class to human beings. They're of a higher order. And so rather than trying to compete with them on the same level, we should figure out how to appease them. So we should, the wizard should become a priest, he says that's why throughout history, priests and the religious class has been so anti-magic. And then he says, post-religion, we have science. And science is actually what magic was trying to get at all along. And science is going to give us the final answer, because science is impeccable, right? Science can give us ultimate knowledge. And the only thing that we can know is through knowledge. Except the claim that the only thing we can know is through scientific knowledge, is that claim itself knowable by science? No, of course not. It's assumed. And this is what Wittgenstein meant whenever he said that, Frazer doesn't really understand the presuppositions that he is operating on. And that's what makes his tone toward these primitive peoples and these superstitious people seem so, haughty and, just meh. And so, again, René Girard, you kind of have to talk about René Girard if you're going to talk about Golden Bough, at least today, because Girard was a scholar of comparative religion, and Golden Bough was obviously one of his big influences. And I think that if you have read Girard before going into Golden Bough, it's hard not to just be thinking about Girard the whole time. And the reason why is because Frazer, toward the end of his book, that's when he really starts to hone in and focus on human sacrifice and its role in the whole magical schema. And this is essentially what all of Girard's work kind of focuses on. And where was I even going with that, man? I know exactly where I was going with that. This is all part of the script, by the way. So essentially, René Girard, he kind of points to scientism, this modern day ideology as a ideology that's kind of even more religious. It's a religion with even more fervor and zeal and religiosity than actual real religions of the past. And why is that? It's because it's operating on totally unquestioned and unquestionable presuppositions, right? This idea that we can attain absolute knowledge of reality. And, if you question the conclusions of science, then you are anathematized. If you question the dogmas of science, you're anathematized, even though these dogmas are changing by the day, by the minute. Only a few years ago, we thought that the universe was X million years old or X billion years old, and today we think that it's so many more billion or million years old or whatever. And the story is like, science is a good tool, but its promise of giving humanity access to absolute knowledge is it's a hollow promise, right? And faith in science is, in a way, it's kind of even more religiously driven than faith in Christianity or something like that. Christianity is really the most subtle science that there is, and long story short, you have to be more religious. You have to be more of a religious nut to actually trust in science in the way that Frazer or the others do. And so what I have to say about this is essentially the book can get very long-winded at points, and once you kind of catch on to what the book's pointing at or driving at, it gets very repetitive. Like I said, I went into this very excited, very intrigued, but it becomes very apparent, at least by page 200, exactly what every single chapter is going to be like, which is essentially Frazer is going to introduce a topic or introduce some superstition or introduce some idea, and then he's going to point to all the instantiations of that idea he can find in all these different cultures. And he's going to essentially at the end of the chapter be like, and that's why I think that X, Y, and Z. And so it's very, dry. It's not as exciting as I thought it was going to be. Now, I'll say I got an abridged version. I think that this could have been abridged even further. I don't lament having to kind of work through this. I think it was a test of will. I think it was a test of endurance. And I think I learned a lot. I was trying to think of how I would write it differently, because the different examples across cultures that he gives, I think they're indispensable. But at the same time, I found myself just being so bored anytime he was going through the different examples of all these things throughout the cultures, because it did get very repetitive. I almost wish he would have condensed it into just his insights that were provided at the beginning and at the end of every single chapter, and maybe even try to elaborate on those a little bit more. And so, essentially, I would recommend this book if you are a student of comparative religion or comparative mythology, or you just have an inordinate amount of time on your hands and you just want to consume a really big book. I would recommend this book. If you've already read René Girard, he's not going to give you any insights that you absolutely would not have had, outside of reading René Girard. I think he is a good supplementary work to reading Girard, only because he does kind of talk more about the superstitious aspect and the aspect of magical systems more in depth than Girard does. Girard kind of talks more about the psychology of desire and stuff like this, but this book is definitely more centered around superstition. Overall, I give it a 6 out of 10, and have a good day.